Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Charmaine Chan, the Master of Ceremony for today. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this public lecture entitled Law and Development in Middle-Income Countries, a Post-Washington, Post-Beijing Consensus by Professor Randall Peerenboom, a professor of law at La Trobe University and associate fellow of the Center of Sociolegal Studies at the University of Oxford. May I now invite our college master, Professor Sir James Berlice, to deliver the opening remarks, please.
It is a particular pleasure to invite Professor Peerenboom to talk to us today. By now, probably quite a lot of you know a lot about it, but I think his career and current standing is very, very good. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. He's a law professor at La Trobe, where he does a lot of teaching in a short period of time. And he lives in Beijing, where he does a lot of legal work, expert witness on various occasions. He's director, as you heard, of the Oxford Foundation for Law, Justice and Society in their China program. He's been a consultant for a variety of places: Asian Development Bank, Ford Foundation, UNDP, EU and China, and other international organizations. And he is co-editor and chief of the Hague Journal of the Rule of Law. He's recently written quite a number of books, or edited them. Pick out one or two titles: Rule of Law in an Era of International and Transnational Governance, and Judicial Independence in China. But there's more. However, I think it's time that I allowed Professor Randall Peerenboom to speak to us. I look forward to it.
Well, it's very nice to be back here and talking to you about a recent project that we just completed that was looking at middle-income countries. And essentially, 70% of the world lives in middle-income countries. In 1960, there were 101 middle-income countries, and only 13 of them graduated in recent years to high-income countries. So it's a particularly interesting issue. Why is it that these countries get stuck? And I'm sure you've all heard about the middle-income trap and questions about whether China's caught in the middle-income trap, or Malaysia, or many of these other countries. And often those issues are addressed by economists and development specialists. But what we wanted to do in this volume was to look at the relationship between law and good governance and this nexus of middle-income country issues. So specifically, a number of issues arose in this process. The first one was, is it actually useful to talk about middle-income countries? Is it an analytically useful concept? There's a huge range in middle-income countries. They range from $1,000 per capita to $12,500 per capita. Some have really large populations, some have very small populations, some are theocracies, some are liberal democracies. You have a huge range. So is it even useful to lump all these countries together? Another issue is there a middle-income trap? You hear about this all the time, and if so, what is that trap? Or are there, you have had some countries that have managed to graduate to high-income levels, and perhaps it's just a myth, an urban myth. Or in the near future, you might have many more countries graduating as well, so perhaps we'll look back on this 20 years from now and say, look, there is no such thing as a middle-income trap. Or another view is, well, not only is there a middle-income trap, there are multiple middle-income traps. So it's another issue we address, and I'll talk about it in a minute. To the extent that there are a number of countries that have succeeded in recent years or previously. What can we learn from them? Do they share any characteristics that could then help policymakers in this development process? Particular interest for people here is that up until recently, in particular, post-World War II, the only regional success story was East Asia. So you had Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, all as high-income countries. And you have obviously China moving up more rapidly. Why is that? Then what is the relationship between politics, in particular political economy, and development in these middle-income countries? Another problem that we wanted to address is that middle-income countries are increasingly existing in a globalized international economic order. So with the rise of these new countries, you've had controversies over development and the Doha round, for example. What is the role that these middle-income countries are playing? Are they challenging the existing international order? What's their role going to be going forward? Then we just tried to say something more generally about the approaches that middle-income countries have to addressing certain social and economic issues. One of the problems that you see is that in middle-income countries, a variety of issues, for example, education, health care, labor, environmental issues are particularly pressing problems. So we'll talk about why that is, but then also what has been done about it, what are some of the success stories, what lessons can we learn about that, and then more generally, what lessons are there for both for government officials and for international aid agencies. So that's more or less what we want to get to, and what our recent project addressed. So let's take the first issue. Is it an analytically useful concept? There are both quantitative and qualitative reasons for thinking it is. We did some correlations. Generally, it's been well known for a long time that there's strong correlations between wealth and most good things in life, including good governance, rule of law, human rights, and other indicators of human well-being, longevity, and so on. So what we wanted to do was try to disaggregate those results, try to sort between high-income country, middle-income country, and low-income country, and see if those relationships hold or if they get stronger or weaker. And what we found essentially was that particularly when that the relationship held, but what was most interesting was that it was particularly strong at the lower-income country stage, or at the lower middle-income country stage, slightly less strong at the upper middle-income country stage. So what basic bottom line of this is that as you get greater wealth, it makes a significant difference to development in lower middle-income countries. But once you reach the middle-income country stage, upper middle-income country stage, it's more a matter of how you use that wealth. How is it distributed? What's it going to? What are your policies? There's also a whole range of qualitative reasons why it makes sense to look at middle-income countries as a separate category. So, of course, one of the arguments is, look, why focus on middle-income countries? Development's difficult at every stage. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. Many countries fail. They can fail at low-income country stage, at middle-income country stage. But structurally, the issues are very different. Low-income countries, obviously, are poor, lack resources, but often the government institutions are also very weak. In some cases, they may be lacking. They also have issues often with war, civil war, or external war. So they face a whole separate set of issues that generally middle-income countries don't face. Middle-income countries, by definition, of course, have some resources, and yet their institutions are weaker than developed countries because of this correlation between wealth and institutional strength. A corollary of this is that middle-income countries can't address all of the challenges at once. And one of the problems with international development advice is that they will come in with these plans and say, here are all these issues you face. You need to address them. but they don't attempt to sequence them or assign them priorities. And middle-income countries are often just overwhelmed by the sheer number of problems they face. So there needs to be some strategic decision about sequencing. Another problem is that demands rise very, very quickly in middle-income countries. At the low-income country stage, you're really in almost a survival environment, and people's expectations from the government aren't necessarily that high. But once you get to the middle-income country stage, you often have inequality. You have some people that are quite well off, and they start seeing the benefits of this greater wealth in some sectors, and they have more leisure time, and they start putting more pressure on governments for better services. And the government itself usually has adopted these notions of rule of law, human rights, and so on that are often quite idealistic standards. So people in middle-income countries often expect the same sort of services out of their institutions that you would get in high-income countries, which obviously is not going to happen given the problems that middle-income countries have. A good example is the judiciary. By the time you get to middle-income country stage, you have a lot more lawsuits. There's a huge rise in lawsuits. The lawsuits are much more diversified. You have commercial suits, you have civil suits, you have environmental suits, administrative suits, and so on. Many of the issues are very controversial, politically, economically, socially controversial. And the courts are being asked to handle these at a stage when they may not have the technical competence, or their powers may not be that strong vis-a-vis the executive or the legislative branch. Some of these issues, separation of power issues, haven't been worked out yet. So oftentimes the judiciaries are very overloaded in middle-income countries. And yet, in general, the advice of development agencies has been to push disputes into the court, to adopt a court-centric approach to dispute resolution. Because there's this high demand, generally that exceeds the capacity of governments, middle-income countries are often politically unstable. So you have regime change, frequent regime change from authoritarian regime to democratic regimes, or democratic regimes to authoritarian regimes, or just change within the same regime type. You'll also start seeing a sharp rise in mass protests or demonstrations, which can often turn violent, again putting pressure on the governments to respond to this kind of social discontent in ways that meet the expectations of citizens who generally have a higher rights consciousness. They often have very difficult time doing this, so whether you're a democratic regime or an authoritarian regime, you often have an increase of human rights violations during this stage. Another problem is the political economy issues become much more salient during this stage. When there's not, in a low-income countries, there's not that much to fight over. There aren't that many resources. Once you start getting to middle-income country stage, there's much more to fight over. Interest groups form. Society becomes much more pluralistic. So it's much harder to reach a consensus about what's needed to drive you to the next phase. Vested interests defend their existing gains against newcomers, and so you have a lot more difficult political economy issues. Generally, because of the increased globalization and the increased penetration of the international economic order on domestic regimes, governments are also restricted in their policy making, and this makes it difficult for them to respond to some of the pressures by adopting, for example, some of the kind of policies that developing countries used to rely on to get rich. They're no longer available because of WTO restrictions and so forth. So those are some of the structural issues that stand out and differentiate middle-income countries from high-income countries or low-income countries. Well, we have to be careful, though, and not to overstate the case. There's obviously a great deal it's a wide range of income, so it's not clear that these categories as they're set up by the World Bank are necessarily the most effective way to classify these different countries at different stages of development. It's also clearly the case that for specific issues, you need to make further distinctions, not just by level of wealth, but by other factors. So usually these things are by GDP per capita, but it's very clear that particularly in terms of the impact on the international economic order or other policy-making areas, the larger countries, the larger middle-income countries, have have much greater say than smaller countries. So for some issue areas, aggregate GDP is much more important than GDP per capita. And of course, as always, we're not saying that GDP per capita is the only thing that matters, or that aggregate GDP is the only thing that matters for development. Obviously, there's a whole set of issues around the notion of sustainable development, and also how these resources are distributed, that are very important in terms of people's quality of life. So, is there an actual middle-income trap? Despite the fact that there are these recent successes, given that there are so few countries that actually do manage to break out of the middle-income country level and get into the high-income country category, and a number of these countries have kind of gone up and down, and basically been mired in this range for a very long time. To me, it seems okay to say there is a middle-income trap. The biggest problem, though, is that there are multiple middle-income traps. So economists almost always focus on a particular kind of middle-income trap that basically applies to larger countries with manufacturing sectors. So you move people from agriculture to manufacturing. They start off on the low end of the value-added chain, and at some point, labor costs increase. They're no longer competitive. They need to move up the value-added chain. Many countries can't. They can't innovate, and so on, and then they get stuck. That is definitely one type of income trap, but obviously it doesn't apply to small countries that are tourist havens or tax havens, or small tourist economies, or countries that have a natural resource base, and so on. So it's not the only type. Political scientists take a very different view of these sorts of things. When they look at the issue of middle-income country trap, they don't think it's so much about economic policies. What they see it is more in terms of these political economy issues, that basically what worked created vested interests. So somehow you got from low income to middle income. In that process, certain groups were benefited. They became richer. They then want to protect their territory. They want to keep that model going, and therefore they oppose reforms, capture the political process, and prevent further development. There's a couple versions of legal middle-income traps as well, and here the idea is that if you look at the high-income countries, they generally have legal systems where the judiciary is independent and relatively autonomous. In middle-income countries, it's very difficult to achieve those conditions, in part because there are technical issues. You can't just give a great deal of independence or autonomy to incompetent or corrupt judges, which is part of the problem. You need to train up judges. It takes a certain amount of time. You need to have professional ethics. You need to have accountability practices, and so on. So in many countries, there's this issue of lack of capacity, which prevents these middle-income country judiciaries from functioning like they do in high-income countries. In other cases, perhaps the capacity is there, but there's these obstructions from the political sector. The executive branch, the legislative branch does not want to empower the judiciary at their expense, or from the private sector. So in many of the Eastern European countries, companies became very powerful, and they essentially undermined the reform process, including efforts to strengthen the judiciary, because they didn't want the judiciary deciding against their economic interests. In any event, I think all of these share a similar problem, that what worked to get you to this stage no longer works. So there was a development model, it was reasonably successful, but you now need to change. And as we all know, it's difficult to change for us as individuals, and it's also very difficult for a group of people to come together and agree on what's needed and to make that change. Politicians aren't necessarily the most forward-leaning. So what do we know about what can we learn about these from the successful middle-income countries? And what do they share? Well, it's not really clear they share anything. You've had development of some of these countries historically, obviously Euro-America. So as I said, some of these countries that are in the high-income country category are very large. Some are small. Some have a resource-dependent economies. Some are manufacturing-based. Some knowledge-based. There's a whole range of countries. The one thing you do see is they generally, by the time you reach this level, tend to be democracies, and they tend, as I said, to have high scores on rule of law. You also see that they cluster by region, so obviously, I'm not going to show you the map, but generally Africa still has many low-income countries. East Asia has this big sector of high-income countries, and then South Asia has a lot of middle-income countries. Central and Eastern Europe is predominantly middle-income country at this stage, and the Latin America, again, has all these middle-income countries. So there's some real questions about why this is, sort of the geography of development that are still being sorted out. So I've already mentioned the relationship between rule of law and good governance. The question there, of course, is what's causing what, and this has gone on. There have been a number of articles discussing this and attempts to sort out the causality using various econometrics to deal with it. And essentially, the conclusion is more or less as you would expect, that the causality runs both ways. Better institution leads to better wealth. On the other hand, having more resources allows you to invest in institutional capacity building. In any event, whether it's 60-40 this way or 40-60 the other way isn't particularly important because the policy implications are the same. You need to strengthen institutions at this stage to continue to get growth. Another issue that really stands out, particularly in upper middle income countries, is that you have rising inequality during this phase. And of course you have great inequality even in many high income countries, but on the whole, the inequality is even larger in upper middle income countries than in high income countries. So one of the lessons, I suppose, is that how these countries succeed is not by following a single path or by necessarily following a single set of policies, but by being pragmatic, by being problem solvers, by figuring out what to do given the particular context. So it's the governments that tend to be very proactive, very flexible, very pragmatic, particularly in Asia, that have been successful. So why have East Asian countries succeeded? To what extent did the failures or the early failures in Central and Eastern Europe suggest that the East Asian model was better? And to what extent is there now a revision of that view because of the recent rise of Central and East Asian countries? So in general, as we all know, the East Asian model was a much more pragmatic approach, a slow, as they say in China, stepping on the stones as you cross the river kind of approach, versus this kind of big bang, change everything all at once kind of approach that you had in Central and Eastern Europe. The results early on in Central and Eastern Europe were quite poor. In comparison, East Asia had very steady, consistent growth without many of the social problems that you had in Central and Eastern Europe. But since then, Central and Eastern Europe has done quite well, and as they've gone into the European Union and so on. Actually, many of this region as a whole now has a significant number of high-income countries. So the question is, well, maybe all this kind of worked out. In the end, maybe it was worth doing. These are contested normative judgments, to be sure. But in any event, it's also, again, a matter of starting conditions. There was, with the fall of the wall in Berlin and so on, the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a need for more radical changes. There wasn't the ability to go necessarily piecemeal in the way that East Asia countries could. I mean, even in China in 1978, after the Cultural Revolution, they were still able to draw on a party that remained in power, a civil apparatus, a bureaucracy that was in place to continue governing and to come up with new policies, but the institutions were consistent. Many of those options weren't available in the Soviet republics, where there was this radical change because of the democratization process and change in leadership and so on. So it's not necessarily very clear that it makes much sense to really have this kind of debate anyway, because you have to play the hand that you're dealt. Generally, there's this huge literature by political scientists on the relationship between regime type and economic development. That literature has shown over and over again that there is no strong relationship between regime type and economic growth. So it's not conclusive. Regime type alone is not the best indicator of whether countries are going to develop or not. The successful countries, whether they're authoritarian regime or democratic regimes, tend to share certain features. Obviously, market economy, they invest in human capital and infrastructure. They develop mechanisms for sharing power and transferring power peacefully so you don't have major political instability. And usually the military is not involved in it. There you don't have a significant amount, you don't have coups and so on. So again, you have political stability. That said, you do have different problems. Different types of regime have different pathologies or have different pathways to success. So they have different advantages and they have different disadvantages. So one of the issues, for example, is we talked about last night, is to what extent can you have a rule of law compliant authoritarian regime? And certainly being an authoritarian regime imposes certain kinds of restraints on the legal system. The ruling regime is not going to allow the judiciary or the legal system to undermine its power. So there's going to be a set or a range of cases or topics that are basically off limits, that are either decided through the political process or through separate courts, military courts, and so on. So that's a different kind of issue than you would have in a democratic regime, and causes problems for the overall development of the legal system longer term. It's one example. You can, in the book that we did, there are many more examples of it, but essentially, I think more important than the differences between these different regime types are the commonalities, the common problems they face, and also the common solutions to them. And for the most part, whether it's an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime, the recommendations for what you need to do in terms of law and development or rule of law and good governance are largely the same. You need to strengthen rule of law, foster good government, combat corruption, increase transparency, and so on. These are all very standard prescriptions. How you go about that may differ from one country to the next, depending upon particular initial conditions. The main thing that comes out of this, though, is that it really is a matter of political economy at this middle-income country stage. It really is a matter of vested interests competing both for economic resources and for political resources, for power, that tends, and how those issues get resolved out, that tend to spell success or failure. So MICs in the international economic order. MICs clearly are now playing a much larger role. The failure of the Doha round essentially shows that MICs are no longer simply going to be takers of international rules. They're challenging the dominance of Europe and America, which used to largely make the rules. There's also in the process the establishment of a middle-income country development bank, so that the equivalent of the World Bank or the ADB set up by the BRICS. So all of this is showing that these middle-income countries are exerting a much greater role on the international economic order, and it's the bigger ones that are leading the charge. And so you can see this in WTO cases. Brazil, India, China are very sophisticated WTO players now. It's very interesting how they did that. WTO litigation is an extremely expensive process. It's very complicated. It took them a long time to develop the technical capacity. They developed strategies for doing it, some of it by outsourcing, by basically hiring the talent from, for example, Washington firms or firms that had experience in this area, by also setting up centers to do some of the work to the economic work, the kinds of analysis that you need to do to support anti-dumping claims or fight them. And they shared that information. So you had this coalition of middle-income countries sharing information because they saw their goals as aligned. But to what extent do MICs actually constitute a stable coalition? If they're going to have significant ongoing impact on the international economic order, they would need to stay unified and to act as a bloc. And part of the problem here is that many middle-income countries, of course, are aspiring to be high-income countries. They have many of the same aspirations. They have many of the same issues. So, for example, China is always known as a major intellectual property violator. This is one of the complaints of high-income countries about China. Yet at the same time, China now is rapidly moving up the curve and is producing a lot of its own intellectual property and exporting a lot of that intellectual property to other developing countries. So it now has an interest in the intellectual property regime or greater convergence with the interest of high-income countries. So you're seeing areas where where middle-income countries are likely to be allied with high-income countries. At the same time, of course, there's also some differences, but what undermines the middle-income countries is that they compete among themselves. So Brazil and China, for example, have a very competitive relationship. In one way, of course, China buys many resources from Brazil and so on, but they have also very much a very competitive relationship, or Mexico and China in certain sectors. So the fact that Mexico thinks Chinese products are subsidized by the state and so on, and that undermines Mexican exports and so on. Or there are currency issues that China's currency is artificially depressed that undermines or gives them an unfair trade advantage versus other middle-income countries. So all these issues are there and make the policy-making process very difficult for middle-income countries and cause problems. So if you actually look at the number of WTO disputes, so far, the large MICs have rarely sued other MICs. It's usually high-income countries versus middle-income countries, or middle-income versus high-income countries. And there were a couple early cases that were settled. But you can expect going forward that there'll be more of these WTO cases. And there's been a few claims made that haven't gone through the formal process yet, but are in the pipeline. So you're likely to see fissures among MICs dependent upon their own particular self-interest and by issue area. Similarly, the MICs in many ways may have been sympathetic to the concerns of low-income countries and may want to co-opt the low-income countries to act as a bloc against high-income countries, as in the Doha round, and yet their interests are often significantly different than low-income countries. So the chances for alliances there are not great. And over time, of course, the idea is that they'll become high-income countries, and then they'll have the same kind of competing interest as current countries. So the result of all of this, I think, is that you're likely to actually see a lot of inconsistency in terms of policy making. That it'll be very much ad hoc coalitions rather than kind of a principled approach to trade issues going forward. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge problem with economic and social rights, or social and economic cases in middle-income countries. The basic problem, of course, is that they have relatively limited resources compared to high-income countries. There's huge demand for spending on all sorts of things, from military to social welfare services to infrastructure and so on. So they don't have enough money to meet all the legitimate demands of different sectors of the society. And the institutions are weak. So many of these complaints that become manifest in the form of claims for economic and social rights end up in the courts, and yet the courts really aren't in a position to provide effective remedies. This then leads to massive dissatisfaction with the with the courts, undermines the legitimacy of courts, but also leads to mass demonstrations or mass protests, people exiting the court system and taking their problems to the streets, which then often results in some sort of repressive backlash. As I mentioned, the rule of law promotion industry advice has generally been to push a court-centric approach. And if you look at the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, their advice is always to increase the capacity of the judiciary to handle these cases and to funnel court cases to the courts. And they, for example, when they asked China about, countries have to report. When they asked China to report, one of the questions, a series of questions focused on to what extent are economic and social rights justiciable in the court, how do the courts handle these cases, and the general advice was you're supposed to increase these cases. China actually did judicialize a number of these cases, labor cases, environmental cases, social welfare cases, and so on, but with very negative results. The courts, as I said, weren't able to actually deal with this, so what happened was the courts then started to refuse to accept them, changed jurisdictional rules to limit who could bring these cases and so on, and basically engaged in a series of defensive actions. China's not alone in this. Brazil, other countries have also, courts in these countries, even courts that are known for being relatively aggressive in accepting economic and social rights, have also adopted similar strategies. The other thing the courts have done, and this challenges traditional notions of judicial independence, is that they've adopted a dialogic or consultative approach. Instead of mandating what the government, the executive branch, or the legislature is supposed to do in terms of the allocation of resources, what they often try to do is set up a mechanism for discussing these issues, a forum for discussing these issues where all the stakeholders come together. China, this takes the form of grand mediation. So you have party representatives, government officials, members from the judiciary, members from the local stability maintenance committee, and various stakeholders all getting together and trying to basically mediate a compromise. So this is very challenging to traditional notions of rule of law because obviously people have rights as defined in the law. These decisions are not being based on a strict application of formal law to the specific case. They're essentially mediating a solution where these rights are watered down in some ways. They're dispensing with a range of cases all at once, and the judiciary obviously is playing a very different role in this process. Rather than deciding cases, it's just one actor collaborating with other actors. But it is interesting that this approach in one form or another has emerged in many countries, from Latin America to South Africa to China. So it's not so much a notion of what type of regime you're embedded in. It's more a matter of a courts, the judiciary, trying to find an effective approach. So what can we say about all this? What can policymakers take away from this? What's very clear, and has been actually clear within the law and development literature for a long time, is that there is no single model of development, that there are various paths to high income status, and there's wide institutional variation among these middle-income countries and high-income countries. This is at odds with this notion of the Washington Consensus or these rule of law templates that tend to impose this kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all solution. But, of course, we also know from the law and development literature that many of these programs have had very unsatisfactory results despite a lot of money and effort being spent. So as I mentioned, successful MICs tend to be very pragmatic and not dogmatic. So if you have the countries that are very much committed to a particular ideology, so whether that was import substitution or whether that was neoliberalism or whether it was something else, tend to be the ones that run amok, rather than being guided by the the results in the current situation and a more experimental approach to things. They're driven by theory and ideology, and it tends to produce less satisfactory results. So if you think of China, for example, they have very much of an experimental approach. They often try things on a local basis. They do local benchmarking. They see if this works. It's a very empirical type of approach. Once they collect all the results, they then ramp it up to a national level. And that's been a quite successful approach. It's often, the results are often very different than what you would think if you had to just design the system or these reforms ex ante, because a lot of times the ideas that are come up are very much kind of local solutions to particular problems. As I said, middle-income countries need to overcome many political economies, obstacles. You're certainly seeing this now in China with the latest decision trying to push through this very aggressive reform agenda that will basically run into opposition from all the vested interests that have undermined reforms over the last 5 or 6 years. And for that, you require a strong, flexible, and proactive leadership. And again, this is where one thing that China has really excelled at. So this latest decision is another example. But of course, they've had 5-year economic plans, a succession of 5-year economic plans to deal with these issues. The judiciary has a 5-year reform agenda. Every 5 years, they come up with a new agenda. So every sector basically has some kind of top-down, some top-level group trying to design policy, and they're often quite sophisticated. They go out, do experiments, then identify what the issues are. They know the comparative literature. They know what's going on in other countries. And then they come up with a plan. Of course, it's not necessarily that it's always easy to implement, but the plans, at least on paper, generally sound pretty reasonable. In contrast, in many countries, they often don't have that kind of administrative capacity. The bureaucracies aren't that efficient. The educational system isn't that good, doesn't produce the same kind of high-quality policy making. So one of the reasons why the East Asian countries stood out was they did have these very strong and relatively competent ministries and bureaucracy. Right. So the other thing is this whole notion of, it's law and development, but as I always say, it's actually development and law. And so we don't want to overstate the importance of rule of law and good governance and the idea that somehow if you enforce contracts, everything's going to be all right, or if you just have this particular set of economic institutions, it's all going to work. You have these institutions, but if you adopt very wrong-headed economic policies, or you make major mistakes with respect to opening up your capital markets too early, you don't have these kind of mechanisms in place to deal with these issues, prudent lending and so on, you will have problems regardless of your legal institution. So you do need to get the economic policy right, and that's why it makes sense that much of this development literature is by the economists. But increasingly, it's also clear that if you want sustainable growth, you need to look beyond just kind of these economic issues, and you do need to look at these institutional development issues as well. So focusing on the international donors, the World Bank, ADB, all these other organizations that are running around dispensing information to developing countries, it's a fairly radical change for them because, first of all, it's pretty clear that there's no point simply pushing these international best practices based on the particular historically contingent development paths of Europe and America and their historically contingent institutions isn't going to work. So we know from the results of this that it hasn't worked. This whole notion of simply mimicking these institutions has not been very successful. And we can see that these institutions operate in a high-income country. They require significant institutional capacity and so on. They are often also the result of a particular path where where they had to overcome a number of political economy obstacles. So they're not necessarily the most efficient or rational or will work the same in a different political or economic context. So I always say it's pushing these international best practices, for example. I remember one conference where they were saying, look, you got judicial corruption. What you need to do is pay your judges like we do in Germany. And this was in China, and there was these judges from Gansu, and they said, wait, how much do you pay your judges in Germany? Oh, we pay them, I don't know, $200,000 a year or something. And the judge from Gansu said, well, that's very interesting, except we haven't even been paid for the last 6 months, right? Forget that amount of money. The local government simply hasn't had the resources to actually pay us. So it's very nice to sort of articulate these ideas or to assume that you can establish these institutions, but you need the resources, you need the capacity, and it's a long-term process. So it's like, to me, it's like showing these things is almost taunting. You have that foul in basketball where you can't jump around after the play and celebrate or something. Hi, we're high-income countries. Look at us, we're very successful. Because there's no way these countries can simply emulate that. It's like Tiger was showing a Tiger Woods video to a kid with a rock and a stick and saying, hey, you want to win the U.S. Open, just go watch this Tiger Woods video. Well, I don't think it's going to be that easy with your rock and stick. You need to slowly work your way up. And so you need to have more emphasis on second-best institutions. There are obviously many problems with them. We know they're not sort of the long-term solution, but they fill a gap at a particular level of development in a particular area. Obviously, many of these things, for example, in the environmental area, you can aspire to these very high environmental standards or labor standards, but they're simply not going to be achievable in many contexts. So sometimes you need to have other mechanisms that are slightly less optimistic that will deal with them. Also, because of this notion that these middle-income countries are so diverse, it's almost impossible for international donors to have a single set of policies. They need to really rely much more on in-country experts than they usually do. Simply having policymakers in Manila or in Washington, D.C. try to develop the right economic or legal reform policies for this whole range of countries isn't going to work. Now, that's a significant shift in hiring practices, institutional culture, and so on. It's probably not going to be very easy. Also, because many of these problems really have to do with allocation of resources and power, basically political issues or political economy issues. These are things that even if you have an idea about as an international donor, you're often, like the World Bank, you're not supposed to be involved in those kind of political issues, but even if you don't have that restriction, you often have very little influence in the outcome of those basically local domestic political disputes. Similarly, the idea of, generally in the past, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so on, IMF, have used conditionalities as a way of pushing the reform process along in these developing countries. But at the middle-income country stage, middle-income countries are they're not inclined to accept conditionalities. They have enough money to basically go on their own, and they won't accept these kind of obligations in return. So it changes the power dynamic as well. Obviously, you need to have a wider range of a menu of options for MICs, but it also needs to be more interdisciplinary. One of the things you see is it's very difficult to work on any particular aspect of these problems. They're often interlinked problems, and that, again, is not the way international organizations are organized. You have the economists, you have the lawyers, you have the healthcare specialists, and so on, trying to get them together to come up with coherent policies to address these issues is almost next to impossible. One of the issues that has come up is in the past is that oftentimes these donors work on a government-to-government basis. So the UNDP will negotiate with the foreign ministry in China to carry out these policies, these economic reforms over the next 5 years. That actually hasn't been very effective because essentially by the time they get around to doing it, the priorities may have changed in China, in which case they simply abandon the agreed terms, Or in any event, essentially, they can only get them to agree to things that they already want to do. So at this stage, rather than trying to come in and dictate the terms or negotiate in advance these long-term agreements about what you're going to do, they should, in my view, many of these groups should move to a more contractual basis. There's also a lot of money wasted on overseas trips and so on because the money's made available. But now China or Indonesia or Vietnam, they've got enough money to pay the World Bank or to pay the UNDP or the Ford Foundation for their particular expertise if they value it. So you can move to a contractual basis, and you would then basically get more specific advice that is needed by the country. All of this led to a second phase, I would say, of the project, where basically Dave Trubeck was working on Latin American new development states, and I was working on, of course, what's happening in Asia, and one of my colleagues, Bohan Bugarik, was working on Central and Eastern Europe, and we started seeing that there was a change in kind of the development model, or people's thinking about the development model. It wasn't the Beijing consensus, it wasn't the Washington consensus anymore, it wasn't the Beijing consensus, but they seemed to be emerging on similar ideas. I'm going to skip a lot of this about the Washington consensus and the East Asian or Beijing consensus. We can talk about it later, what it is or what the problems were. But I think even in China, for example, everybody recognizes that there's the existing development model has kind of run its course, just as it did in Japan. And to avoid the sort of problems that Japan has had, they need to start more proactively shifting their development model. The World Bank issued this report about China being caught in the middle income trap, but even before that, the party itself had issued statements that the current model is uncoordinated, unsustainable, inefficient, and so on. So they identified the issues or what they need to do, but they weren't able to do it again because of political economy type obstacles. So what is it that this new model would do as compared to the old models, the Washington consensus and the Beijing consensus? The first is that the old models are almost entirely based on content. They're basically a set of prescriptions about what you need to do and say very little about the process or methodology reform. And one of the things that we've emphasized over and over again is the countries that are successful are the ones that develop their own their own development agenda and have an approach or a process that actually works. So this notion that you can have a diversity of end states, you're not necessarily all converging on the same model of capitalism or the same type of judiciary or the same type of rule of law. So it's not one size fits all. You need to have experimentation, more emphasis on these second best solutions, something that works for a period of time and then will be abandoned. And this could include things like infant industry protection. Ideally, of course, you want industries to compete, but in the history of development, almost every country has supported certain industries or certain companies as part of that process. Doesn't always work, but in many cases it does lead to these large multinational companies. So part of what's going on is to try to come up with solutions that aren't necessarily perfect, but may work at this stage of development and then phase them out over time. Another aspect that we've seen, and this goes to the whole notion of how formalized you want you want to be. So many of the countries that have been quite successful, for example, Japan worked on the notion of informal guidance with companies, this relationship between the ministry and companies. China, of course, has many rules, but the policy making, the regulatory framework is very flexible. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of room for discretion. If you contrast that with, say, the European Union model, they came into many of these countries with 86,000 pages of detailed reforms about the type of telecommunication systems you need, the type of legal system, how you should evaluate the court performance and all these sorts of things. So it's very much this notion of of much more formalized sets of rules as opposed to much more informal, flexible approach. And the argument again has been that the Asian countries that have relied less on law and more on kind of informal policy or flexible policy have actually done better. And as I said, you have to really be much more aggressive and not let other countries come in and tell you how you're going to do this. So moving from process to substance, much of this is going to seem familiar to people familiar with the development state in Asia, because much of it is quite similar. The biggest difference is that on the one hand, you had the Washington Consensus, essentially the neoliberal approach of the invisible hand, heavy reliance on the market. In Asia, you had a very heavy hand, a lot of intervention in the economy and economic matters. And what we're seeing is a sort of conversion on a new role for the state, a more responsive, smarter state, this kind of middle path. So what is this smarter, responsive state supposed to do? It's supposed to correct market failures, deal with, have a more long-term view. So you need to have, again, this effective public sector that's taking these approaches. So Brazil has set up an organization that is essentially in charge with this kind of thing, looking at long-term development issues, trying to develop long-term strategies, and then trying to coordinate between the public sector and the private sector, because there are certain problems in terms of innovation and research and so on. How do you get new industry started? How do you get companies going in these areas? Or how do you get the information being produced in universities into the hands of companies so that it can be commercialized? A government's playing this kind of intermediary role or this liaison role in that process. In terms of regulation, you're moving away from kind of top-down regulation to more hybrids, or where the government is the main regulatory actor, to a more hybrid system. So you have a lot of private sector actors or industry actors that will be setting standards for particular industries or taking over more of the governance of it. And another common area among Brazil, South Africa, China, and some of the other larger middle-income countries is that there's this notion of you need to have humane social policies. It's not all about simply about aggregate GDP and how fast you can grow, but also about dealing with some of the growing pains, some of the issues that you have along this process. There are winners, there are losers, and you need to compensate the losers, and you need to make sure that you invest in human capital and institutions so that these people have more opportunities to participate in the process longer term. So again, Brazil has been very active in this area with a whole range of social policies, from minimum wage support to other sorts of policies that essentially redistribute some of the income to the least advantaged members of society. So generally, this is very similar to the East Asian model. You know, you adopt like they say nowadays, there's not that much disagreement about the macroeconomic principles for the domestic economy that were part of the Washington Consensus. This has become commonly accepted. What was controversial about the Washington Consensus were the neoliberal aspects, the emphasis on privatization, deregulation, a very minimal role for the state. So again, there's this emphasis now that there needs to be some government intervention in these middle-income countries, a more active role, but one that is, that is different than in the past. So you see a couple areas in particular where you see convergence. There have been a number of financial crises in developing countries. So the response to that has been capital controls or some controls on getting your money in and out of the country, and then also control of the banking sector. So as in China, you have some large state banks or banks that are essentially policy banks. This was particularly the case after the financial crisis, where these banks played a much bigger role in kind of stimulating the economy and avoiding some of the negative consequences of the crisis. There's also a different relationship between the international and domestic economy, gradually opening to competition. So this whole notion of whether you should have infant industry protection, and there are different views of that. Should you try to find particular industries that are close to the frontier and support them, or should you try to invest in new areas? You don't have any particular advantage now. People are debating that. countries are taking different strategies. But generally, you're seeing many countries trying to promote national champions, but at the same time, trying to promote national champions that will, over time, be internationally competitive and be at the high value-added part of the curve. So obviously, a lot of these things are being worked out on the fly. There's a lot of unhappiness, of course, with the Washington Consensus, a lot of unhappiness with the Beijing Consensus, but people are simply, and the financial crisis came along, so people are trying a lot of different things. Whether all these things are going to prove successful or not, it remains to be seen. It's probably unlikely that they will. Some of the policies that are being adopted probably will turn out to be not so great in retrospect, or to work in some places or in some contexts and not others. That's what you would expect. And in fact, it's interesting that Dave Trubeck and his group on Latin American New Development States first had a number of these policies, a number of these actions that the New Development State was doing. And they were all, oh, this is great, look, it's really working well, look at Brazil's GDP's really high, and all these things are getting better. And then 5 years later, volume 2, it was like, oh, well, some of those things didn't work out so well. So conditions changed, and they had to rethink some of those things. So I think one of the things you need to do, one of the lessons of this, of course, is that you do need to have this more pragmatic approach, and you need to be willing to change. You can try policies out, and if they fail, you need to abandon them and try something else. Again, you can't have this kind of ideological commitment to particular things, whether it's minimum wage or helping particular sectors or whatever. You need to be more pragmatic about it. Some of the problems are, it's not clear whether these policies would also work in the even more underdeveloped context of low-income countries, right? These policies are tending to work in Brazil, China, South Africa, India. These are large regional leaders that have more resources than some of these low-income countries. It's very possible that some of these policies wouldn't work in low-income countries. For sure, it assumes a more technocratic, highly educated, highly efficient public sector than many low-income countries have. Of course, this whole thing, again, is basically adopting the same kind of approach, which has failed in the past, which is to look at what succeeds and then, on the basis of that, simply prescribe the same thing without a great deal of thinking about why it succeeds or what are these necessary conditions, sufficient conditions, what else is needed to make these things work. So it's still prescription is description. So finally, let me just say, to what extent will there be this new consensus? Okay, if we can agree that there are these certain policies, I'll talk more about it in a couple of papers. This is just a very general overview. But if you think there is this set of policies out there that is now being build of this new post-Washington Beijing consensus, maybe the kind of thing that this new middle-income country development bank will push. Will that then will it be a consensus or not? And some of the people who have looked at this said to become a consensus, you need to have, it has to be legitimated by economic knowledge, and of course economists disagree about many of these things. For example, the wisdom of infant industry protection and trying to pick national champions and so on. It has to be embraced by policymakers and many national governments, and in particular it has to be enforced by transnational authorities. So you need to have the Europe and America kind of buying onto this. To what extent can the middle-income countries themselves create a program or a development model that others will follow? If you go by these criteria, I don't think the Washington Consensus or the Beijing Consensus would have been a consensus in any sense either. I mean, these are very high standards. I think what you do have is you do have a certain sense of working principles that are being shared among developing countries, particularly these middle-income countries, through this increasingly dense network, transnational network that's being set up. And it's likely to have considerable influence among a lot of these countries. So we'll have to see what happens going forward. But for now, that seems to be the direction among among many of these countries.
Thank you, Professor Peerenboom, for the wonderful speech. Professor Peerenboom will now take some questions from the floor. May I now also invite Professor Sir James Merlis on the stage to facilitate the Q&A session. Professor Merlis, please.
Oh. Yes, thanks.
Okay, I think the question up.
I'm an economics student, and I have studied a middle income trap problem, and I appreciate your perspective of looking at the problem. And I agree with you on the role of good governments in getting around the middle income trap. And secondly, I think one of the important aspects of the good governments is that they can impact the economy through good public finances. And do you think that there are some institutional obstacles that undermine the better allocation of public finance? For example, in my mind, I think that in the early stage of development, then the government would be better focused in building physical capital or infrastructure, and in the later stage of development in human capital and technology.
I think that's right. That if you compare India and China, for example, one of the problems India is running into are the bottlenecks from very poor infrastructure. So I think if you spend more money on infrastructure, you can expect quicker returns from that investment. The problem is, at some point, the investment in the infrastructure becomes not that efficient. So if you look at China, for example, they've had this very state-led investment model with exports and so on. So, it's been working, but now increasingly growth rates are down, and they're really worried about overspending on these sorts of things. They're not getting as much return for the investment anymore. So that's one set of problems. Is when do you taper off on the investment in infrastructure, and what type of infrastructure do you develop? When do you shift to investing in other sorts of things, whether human capital, whether technology, whether medical services, or whatever? The other issue, of course, is that, is an ethical one, a normative one, that yes, in China and elsewhere, if you invest in infrastructure, you may have higher growth, but you have this kind of financial repression to fund it, right? You've had these very low interest rates, and then the policy banks funding these infrastructure projects and these state-owned enterprises and so on. And that comes at a cost to many other things, the environment, better medical services, better public education, and so on. So, China obviously has allocated its resources very much towards things that produce a high return and quick growth. And that has led to this very unbalanced growth. And now they need to address it.
You mentioned that high-income countries tend to be democracies. You mentioned that high-income countries tend to be democracies. Do you view that democracy is something that could be an obstacle to the rise of, say, low-income countries? Or that is, they're not ready for democracy until they achieve a certain stage?
So if you look at the overall surveys, the general surveys that sort by regime type, it doesn't show any distinct advantage to being a democracy or an authoritarian. You could have growth under both. You can have problems under both. What is interesting is the highest growth rates tends tends to come from the authoritarian regimes. So they tend to be the most successful for various sorts of reasons, perhaps because they can steer things in the direction of infrastructure, take long-term policies, and they don't need to care about the fact that people are pushing back at them and want, you know, money spent on education and so on. There may be, to the extent that they're successful, then they're more stable and so on. Democratic regimes at these lower level of development tend to be pushed by these public pressures. It doesn't produce the growth. Then there's more political turmoil and turnover and so on. And that produces this kind of cycle. So it seems to be the case, and it's certainly the case that GDP per capita is also very closely related to the survivability of democracy. So you reach certain levels of development, your chances of remaining a democracy are very high, which is why most of the high-income countries, well, the high-income countries are democracies. Once they become democracies at that level, they don't revert to authoritarianism. So in general, I think there are a lot of arguments in terms of these kind of sequencing arguments for certain advantages to an authoritarian regime, provided it's the right kind of regime, one that's like the East Asian regime. All of the East Asian countries, of course, democratized at a much higher level of wealth than the average, right? So they were well along in terms of the institutional development process, because while they're growing, they're investing in human capital, they're investing in institutions. So the legal system is much stronger when they do democratize. Its role may be limited in civil and political rights cases, but at least the judges are competent, there's a constitutional court and so on. So as soon as they democratize, then the judiciary can step in and handle those cases in a credible way. If you democratize at lower levels, there's all sorts of weak institutions, and they're often very unstable, and they're not that competent, and they can't withstand pressure from the executive or the legislature as part of this process of sorting out the winners and losers from the transition process. And so the lack of rule of law or lack of a solid legal system is very noticeable in the failures of many of these lower income democracies.
So would you expect an authoritarian state to become a democracy when it reaches a certain level of
Yeah. So let me just add one point. So as I said, the authoritarian regimes have the highest growth. Some authoritarian regimes have the highest growth rates. At the same time, many authoritarian regimes are clustered at the bottom, right? They're the real disasters, right? So it's like, okay, if you get the authoritarian regimes that tend to be forward-looking and adopt these sort of policies, invest in human capital as opposed to just taking all the resources for themselves or engaging in war and making bad decisions, that's good. So, but who knows which one you're going to get, I suppose. Whereas democracy, I suppose, is kind of a more middle ground and gives you chances to revisit the issue in a more peaceful way and maybe modify your course along the way. So now to go to the question about whether you're likely to make a transition to democracy. Yeah, I think so, right? I mean, there are various reasons for that, I think, but demands from the citizens, the need to have, because you become much more pluralistic society, and you don't have a single conception of the good, you don't have a single conception of resources, you need some way of divvying up the resources and dealing with these kind of conflicts of ends and so on. And that's hard to do in an authoritarian model, right? Because there's ultimately a substantive decision made without the legitimacy of the political participation. So you don't, it lacks legitimacy, and people don't accept it as much. So democracies clearly have more procedural legitimacy in terms of these kinds of conflicts that arise from a more pluralistic society. So even if you don't get the result you want, you're more likely to accept it if you've had some say in the process, kind of thing. And there are other sorts of reasons as well. I think the economy becomes more complicated. You need more free flow of information, which is hard to achieve in more authoritarian regimes. They need to, as in China, they need to move towards the government has to play a less intervention role. They need to start relying on civil society and on other actors and so on. They then become more powerful, and then they challenge the regime, and they don't want to go along with it anymore, and they demand liberal democratic reforms. You have the whole support from the international, from the international order and so on. So it's very hard, and I don't think they're really, you have some of these Mid-Eastern states that have resisted democratization and are basically oil-rich. I think it's easier to do if you're if you're controlling the oil, controlling the single resource, and you combine that with spending those resources to buy off the public so that they don't push for more political reforms by giving them education and medical services and relatively decent institutions and governance and so on, which is what a lot of these oil-rich countries have done in the Mideast. But in general, I think it's very hard to kind of resist those changes over time.
Professor Peerenboom, as a non-expert in the area, I hope you allow me to ask a very basic question. And that is, this classification of countries according to the income seems to carry with a premise that the right direction for development is to go from low income to the middle income, then to the high income. But short of an utopian world, it's impossible for all countries to be all in high income. So what would be a realizable, stable kind of equilibrium state under this kind of framework?
Right. So I did make the point there that there are this notion of simply increasing GDP or even GDP per capita is not the be-all or end-all of a good life. That you need to have sustainable development, you need to have equal distribution of the resources, you need to have greater longevity, a higher quality of life, and so on. And that's clearly, to some extent, it's incompatible with everybody achieving that all at once if people are going to do it in the same way, that if people are going to continue to act in the same way they do now, right? If everybody's going to have cars, everybody's going to have the environmental footprint of the average American, it would be pretty much a disaster for everybody, it would seem. So that said, it's still the goal. It's still what everybody wants, and when they get rich, they tend to act that way. So it's hard to stop them from doing that. And I suppose, you can make a bunch of, many of my, I used to do philosophy, many of my friends are philosophers, and they spend all their time talking about ideal theory and the normative conditions for a good life. And all very interesting, doesn't really have much to do with how people act, and doesn't seem to really lead into an actual, realizable political agenda. So to me, it's going to be a long time before we get to the stage where the rich really are forced or are pressed enough to redistribute their income to others and to adopt a more sustainable approach. So let's put it this way. I don't expect to be here for that day.
Thank you, Professor Peerenboom, for your very interesting lecture. I'm a third-year student at the Faculty of Law. I just want to ask, just then, you were explaining about how in East Asian countries that they have followed a model in which they first ensure economic growth, and then through a very strong bureaucracy or a very strong administrative sector, push these countries towards a more democratic system of government. And on the other hand, you have, in the lecture, you have stated that as opposed to, say, East Asian countries or other middle-income countries that have moved towards high-income systems, those older high-income countries have economic policies at their disposal that are no longer viable to be used by modern middle-income states to push themselves into high-income states. So could you further elaborate on how these, say, lack of choices have shaped these changes in policies that have been used by middle-income countries in recent years?
Yeah, sure. There's there's a great book called Kicking Away the Ladder. But basically, and it argues essentially that many of the policies that rich countries adopted are not the policies they're advocating the old rich countries adopted for the new developing countries. I mean, first of all, very few of the countries were true democracies, or at least would be considered democracy by today's standards when they got rich, right? You know, if you think of America or others, right, vote was very limited, women couldn't vote, minorities couldn't vote, very different conception of democracy, to the extent that they even were democracies to begin with, while they were getting rich. They obviously didn't have the protection of intellectual property rights, and they all, you know, stole from each other and engaged in industrial espionage and tried to prevent people from sharing their ideas and technology with other countries through various sorts of regulations and so on. Many policies that, you know, WTO essentially restricted the space from subsidies and tariffs and other sorts of things for countries to engage in. That said, you know, there are exceptions. There are areas where lower income countries have certain sort of benefits. Low income countries in the categories of WTO. And there's still some policy-making space, obviously, within here. And of course, what you're seeing is a pushback on the WTO and these multilateral processes, right? So with the Doha round, an attempt to claw back some of the space for developing countries, and also the move towards more regional systems and bilateral trade agreements and so on, which is undermining kind of this universal approach. So even some of the things that the East Asian countries did, you know, would no longer be tolerated in China's case and so on. And in China's, the terms that China entered the WTO on were extremely onerous, right? And there are many things that really have very little to do with trade, like anti-surge mechanisms and, you know, the anti-dumping rules where it's not considered a market economy and so on. And so they're looking at other countries in the region. So there are many things that I think will be revisited in the next few years, but this gets to this issue of what will happen to these middle-income countries when they become rich. Like, what will China do when it reaches the next stage of development? Will it try to change these rules to make it more favorable for these countries for these other countries to follow up the ladder, or will it say, hey, we're rich now and let's continue with these policies that make it more difficult? And of course, you know, China's also taken a very different approach to international assistance in Africa and so on, but that's kind of a separate topic.
You mentioned earlier there doesn't seem to be a lot of commonality across the middle-income countries, but it seems to me for quite a number of them, corruption is an issue. So I'm just wondering how you view corruption in terms of the middle-income gap, in the sense that do you need a little bit of corruption to move from the low-income countries to become a middle-income countries, but then you need to get rid of it to become a high-income country?
Yeah. You know, I guess it'd be interesting to have some test cases, you know, controls where a country got there without corruption, but that never happens. So, you know, whether it's, if you think about corruption, you can see why you would have corruption in middle-income countries, right? You have more resources, more wealth, and yet you don't have all the institutional mechanisms to hold people accountable. And often there are limitations on the media and other sorts of restrictions. So I think it's to me it's, and the nature of corruption may be different than maybe more petty corruption or maybe at the policy-making level and so on. But I think what's interesting about middle-income countries versus high-income countries is not necessarily how much corruption there is. Yeah, I think there's a lot of corruption in high-income countries as well. I think it takes somewhat different form. Some of the forms which are legalized, like the emphasis of lobbying, basically undermines the policymaking process and produces the same kinds of results that are helpful to a limited number, but not to the broad public. So, but the solutions to the problems are very different, right? So, because in the high-income countries, you have rules, you have the media, you have agencies that can go out and conduct investigations and have the power to do it, and they have more independence and so on. You have the media being able to go out and expose these things. You have civil organizations, you have democracy. You have a whole set of institutions that allow you to attack the problem of corruption to one degree or the other, disclosure requirements, transparency requirements, a whole sort of set of things that don't exist in middle-income countries, are not implementable or problematic just because, again, they're less developed institutions. So you need to have a separate, so this again gets into this whole notion of second best solutions and how do you do this. So like, what's an example of a second best solution? Let's take Shuangwei in China. So you've got, this party system that basically is extra constitutional, extra legal. There's no basis for this practice. Essentially, the party can say to government officials who are party members, almost always party members, we are going to detain you, and we are going to not let you talk to your family, and we're going to investigate whether you've committed corruption. So that solution is not one that a high-income country that respects rule of law would endorse. It violates, obviously, all sorts of you could argue it violates China's own criminal law and own constitutional order. It certainly violates the ICCPR and other sort of international treaties. And yet it's hugely popular and hugely effective in China, right? I mean, there's very few people that have a great deal of sympathy for government officials who are swept up in this process, right? And their idea would be the more the merrier. And it's effective. And it's effective in part because it deals with issues that are typical in middle-income countries. So the corruption has become more systemic. It's not the petty corruption that you have in low-income countries. Here's $5, let me do this. You now need to bribe a whole range of people to get something done, a whole range of approval authorities or a whole range of judicial judges, right? So you need to have all of these people complicit in it. And that's why when you have these major corruption cases, there goes the government of Shenyang, there goes the Shanghai High Court judiciary, right? Because they're like all part of it, because they have built up enough accountability that there are these checks and balances internally. So if they operated properly, somebody in the system would expose this. So you have to co-opt the whole system to make it work that way, to be able to, to corrupt it. So then the response is one of, let's take some of the people involved in this, hold them and detain them, don't let anybody know about it, don't let them contact people so that they can start building up all the information, following, charting out, mapping out the networks, and then going after these people. Because if you just followed a normal legal procedure, they would immediately call up all these people, destroy all the evidence, and you would get nowhere, and everybody would be protecting themselves. So yes, it's a major violation of human rights. Sometimes it is going to capture innocent people and cause tremendous problems for them. They could, all sorts of problems for them and their families. But for the most part, it's going to catch government officials who are corrupt. And in the only way they can actually do it. So, that's the kind of thing. It's a pragmatic, very context-specific solution. It's very particular to China because it's a party process, as opposed to, say, if you didn't have a party, it'd be a very different kind of system, right? So other countries may have their own solutions. But what is definitely clear is that relying on the courts for this or setting up anti-corruption commissions just don't work. Hong Kong and Singapore are two examples where it did work, but those are very particular places, very small. This kind of, Hong Kong, kind of the colonial influence, a certain amount of regularity and institutional development to begin with. Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew and his whole thing. But, when you have so few people, you can easily monitor the corruption just by, everybody knows what everybody has, essentially. So it generally doesn't work, though. So the solutions that they tend to propose, again, are based on these notions of a political system that's like in a high-income country system. So you've got the media that can do these sorts of things and investigate. You've got elections. You've got courts that are independent and authoritative and so on. And that's those conditions just don't exist in most of these middle-income countries. So you need new solutions.
I'm going to just have a quick comment question. I mean, one of the things that I take from this, which I rather agree with in a modified way, but I want to put a particular slant on, is that perhaps what is strongly suggested by doing this division into high income, middle income, low income, is that it's going to lead to recommendations on the basis of saying high income countries are like this and have been like this. So we recommend middle income countries to move towards that. In various ways you are suggesting that might not be right. I strongly agree. I wanted to give an example. I think that it's a very bad idea two examples to go where the high income countries have been. One is the banking system. And I think the middle income countries benefited greatly in the crisis by not having the banking system that gets into all the gambles and derivatives and so on. So it's better to have an old-fashioned one of the kind that, and perhaps also a state-owned one that runs. And the other, and this is slightly more of a question, but the other is one that I think many people would be inclined to agree with. Environmental policies are going to need to be different and much more demanding.
In middle-income countries.
Yeah, whatever the high-income countries are now doing is not the model. There may be some models there in some places, like I think London dealt with smog quite effectively. But I wouldn't want to look to the United States for its greenhouse gas policies.
So exactly right, and I totally agree with all of this. And I think the problem is how you achieve realistic goals, how you set realistic goals, and how you achieve them. And you need to adopt and you need to again have a fairly sophisticated ability to make policy, to make differentiated policy, to make cost-benefit analysis of what's an effective treatment, which factors can we afford to shut down. And once you've done all that, then you need to deal with the real problems, which are the political economy problems. Once you shut down, this is Beijing and Hubei all over again. So everybody knows that Hubei, a lot of the pollution in Beijing is coming from Hubei. And a lot of that is extremely inefficient, not very productive coal mines and so on. So it's in everybody's interest to first shut them down, and then to kind of move up to the next stage and say, no, this group, you're not so bad, and if you just use these sort of devices or treatment methods or something, that'll be enough. In both of those cases, there are economic costs, and the economic costs don't match the political units. So the economic costs are borne by Hubei citizens and Hubei governments, and the benefits go to Beijing people. So this is like rich countries and poor countries in terms of climate change. It's the same thing. So now you need to figure out some transfer mechanism of how you pay them off to make it worthwhile. And that, again, is why it's easier in an authoritarian regime. Because an authoritarian regime can come in and say at the level, look, Hubei, you are going to shut these factories down because this is a national disgrace for Beijing to have this kind of pollution. And Beijing, you are going to transfer some money to them to do that. And if it were a democracy, it'd be really hard to force state governments fighting with their autonomy to actually deal with these sorts of things. So, the central government could try to do it, but the central government would, have a national policy, not one which says takes money from this state and gives it to the other state kind of thing. Very hard to kind of deal with those shifting of resources, local shifting of resources without somebody at the center in charge. But let me give another example. I think labor is another area. So you can say all you want about labor standards. So one of my friends worked as a compliance officer for Nike, and his job was to go around and to all the subsidiaries of Nike, subcontractors of Nike, and make sure they were in compliance with Nike's very first world standards in terms of in terms of working conditions, the quality of the air, the temperature, work breaks, and all these sorts of things. None of the factories were. So the person would say to the owner, "You're not compliant. You're not in compliance." He says, "Yeah, I know. Show me where I'm not in compliance." And so here's the list. Here's the 25 things you're not in compliance. He says, "Okay, you want me to comply with all these? I'm not going to be able to operate. So let's get all the employees out here. Okay, here's the list. Here's number 1. Do you want to work or do you want this? We'll keep our job. Okay, that one. Cross that one out. Do you want this one or do you want, And so they basically went down and tried to have a negotiation to say, what's realistic here? Okay, this one's cheap. It's something we can do. Let's try to address that, right? These other ones, it's just not feasible. So it was, of course, what do you say to Nike? Right? So the compliance officer then is in this real ethical bind because obviously her proper job is to go back to Nike and report all these things. And a strict implementation would then mean all these people are out of work, and the bosses are sad, and the people are sad, and they're all begging them, don't do this, try to make the report better. So they write this, generally went back and wrote this report that, well, they understand the issues and they're taking steps to correct them, and will, in a progressive way, deal with these issues over time.
Okay, we're over time. First, I want to say thank you very much. Great topic.
Thank you, Professor Peerenboom and Sir James Bernice. As a token of appreciation, may I invite Sir James to present Professor Peerenboom with a souvenir from Morningside College.
Nearly transparent. Transparency is good, right?
A lot more transparent than the Beijing air, anyway.
May I also invite college master, fellows, and guests to the stage to take a picture with Professor Peerenboom as well. Once again, thank you, Professor Peerenboom, for delivering such an inspiring lecture today. And on behalf of Morningside College, I would like to sincerely thank all of you for being at the lecture today. This is the end, and we hope all of you will continue to pay attention to the upcoming Morningside College public lectures. We hope to see you all in the near future again. Thank you.